Okay, so we reviewed Barbara Welter's Cult of True Womanhood, and we see that it's generally a negative take on women's role in the private sphere in the mid-1800s. Now, we'll look briefly at Carol Smith Rosenberg's Female World of Love and Ritual, the excerpt I gave you. That was written in 1975. So Welter's is from 1966, one of the pioneering works in women's history. Smith Rosenberg's comes a bit later on. And keep in mind that historians have to read all the work in their field, so Smith Rosenberg undoubtedly read Cult of True Womanhood. She decided she wanted to look into somewhat the same idea, the same historical question: what were women's roles like in the 19th century? Even though some of her sources are from the 18th century, what was the private sphere like? So, the Female World of Love and Ritual, just from the title, sounds a lot more positive, you could say, has a generally good connotation, unlike the Cult of True Womanhood. So right there, you can see that Carol Smith Rosenberg is portraying or interpreting her sources in a more positive way than Barbara Welter did roughly 10 years prior. Barbara Welter's sources were magazines, things like that, published sources, while Smith Rosenberg's primary sources are mostly diaries and letters, more personal. And remember, or you should know, that letter writing is really a lost skill, that people used to write these wonderful letters back and forth to each other before we had telephones or email or, texting. So letters are a good historical source. So what did this female world look like? She describes it very well. I don't have to go over every detail. This network of support and basically emotional support for each other. Some people say it's like Facebook, where all women's friends were just women and they didn't have any real male connections. So women were socialized to hang out and to have emotional attachments to other women. The sexes were basically socialized separately. So boys were kept together. In the article, she said that males were like an alien group, right? They weren't part of this female world. They were approached by women in an awkward, stiff way. They approached each other in an awkward way because they didn't really socialize with each other. So there's a connection between relatives, between mothers, daughters, sisters, cousins. Then it becomes friends, even mother's friends, things like that. They help each other over the life cycle. There are many visits back and forth. They're very close. Just one anecdote where a woman's friends or family came with her on her wedding night, which is kind of humorous. Think about that happening today on your wedding night, having, your relatives there tagging along. So there's friendship that's happening. There's relatives also in this female world. And then towards the end of the article, she goes into the idea of sexuality, because there is some evidence that there was some sexual relations between some of these women. Intimacy, different types of intimacy. So she states that we can't just judge basically if they're being deviant. And at that time that Smith Rosenberg is writing, homosexuality is still seen as deviant, very deviant. And we saw in our class discussions that some groups also see it as deviant today, as, a bad, immoral thing against God and various religions. So Smith Rosenberg, towards the end of the article, she's basically saying we can't judge these relationships by our current standards of deviance. We have to see these relationships within the larger female sphere, within the larger private sphere. And she states that at this time, women and girls had a greater freedom to act in a larger variety of ways without being labeled deviant. So when we think about history, the 1800s, the Victorian era, we think people were very repressed, that they kept everything in. They kept in their emotions. But one of her main points at the end is that they had more freedom than people did when she was writing in the 1970s to express themselves in different ways along a spectrum. She wants us to see these relationships along the spectrum of different variations, and she also thinks we should see sex in a spectrum, that sexuality could vary from person to person. It's not just black or white, or even it's not even just straight or gay, straight, bisexual, gay, that there's all these different variations of sexuality, and that the 19th century gave greater freedom to these expressions of sexuality than the later 20th century. So when I asked you to compare the cult to the female world of Love and Ritual, what I wrote in my notes and what you should really get out of this is that Rosenberg looks at the private sphere and says it wasn't so bad. Women might not have had a public power or a public role, but within the private sphere, they were able to develop their own relationships to lead these rich, compelling lives, despite the fact that they lacked power in society. They had self-esteem. They basically had lives. Whereas if you read Welter, you'd see it as the private sphere as mostly oppressive, repressive, you know, um, almost brainwashing for women. But, Smith Rosenberg kind of turns that around and says there was this, they were in their own world, they were in the private sphere, but it wasn't that bad a place to be.